The text came at 6:47 in the evening on Christmas Eve. I was in the garage finishing the last of the wrapping, because I had always been the one who wrapped the presents, and I had always done it in the garage on Christmas Eve with the door cracked and the radio on, and a cup of coffee going cold on the workbench, the way I had done it for 19 years of marriage, and 3 years before that of being the kind of man who planned ahead for the people he loved. The paper was spread across the workbench. The scissors were in my hand. My phone was face up on the corner of the bench, and it lit up with the notification, and I set the scissors down, and I picked it up, and I read what she had written. It was not a long text. Margaret had never been a person who used more words than she needed, and the text was consistent with that quality in a way that I might have appreciated in different circumstances. She said she needed space. She said the holidays had become too much. She said it would be better if I found somewhere else to be for Christmas, and that she would explain when she was ready. She said she was sorry. I stood in my garage on Christmas Eve with wrapping paper on the workbench and scissors in my hand, and I read that text twice. Then I set my phone down carefully. I looked at the presents on the workbench, 19 of them, wrapped and labeled for my wife and my children and my grandchildren. I stood there for about 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone again and I began making calls. Not to Margaret, not to find somewhere else to be. I began making calls to cancel absolutely everything I had arranged for the people who had apparently decided I did not need to be included in it. My name is Thomas Brewer. I am 63 years old. I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, the younger of 2 sons raised by a father who worked in insurance and a mother who managed the household, and volunteered at the public library 3 afternoons a week for 30 years, because she believed that access to books was a civic responsibility and not a luxury. I grew up in a house where people showed up for each other without being asked, and where the word family was not decorative but operational, meaning it described something you did rather than something you were. I carried that understanding into my adult life and into my marriage and into the raising of my 3 children, and into 22 years of building a regional logistics company that I had started in my late 30s with 2 trucks and a dispatch system I had designed myself on a desktop computer in the spare bedroom. I sold the company at 60 for a figure I will not specify, but that represented 40 years of disciplined work and good judgment, and the particular multiplication that happens when you build something correctly and hold it long enough for the compounding to do what compounding does. I was, at the time of the text, a retired man of comfortable means with a wife of 22 years, 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, a house in Tennessee that I had maintained and improved over 19 years, and a Christmas Eve tradition that I had upheld every year of my marriage without exception. The tradition was simple. I wrapped the presents. I made the coffee. I drove to the Christmas Eve service at the church 3 miles from the house. I came home and we watched a film. I was, as of 6:47 on that Christmas Eve, no longer doing any of those things. Margaret was the kind of woman I had spent 30 years not meeting before I met her. She was precise and clear-minded, and had a sense of humor that appeared without warning in situations where you did not expect it, and that made her, in the years when things were good between us, the most reliable source of unexpected delight I had ever encountered. We met at a conference in Nashville in 1999. She was 40 at the time, working as a healthcare administrator, and she had the quality of someone who knew exactly what she thought about most things and had stopped pretending otherwise. I was 41 and had been divorced for 4 years from a marriage that had not been anyone's fault in particular, and had been everyone's fault in general, and that I had processed completely enough to know what I had done wrong and what I would do differently. What I would do differently was show up. I showed up for Margaret completely and consistently for 22 years. I was present for every significant event and many insignificant ones. I remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and the specific preferences and dislikes that accumulate around a person over decades of close attention. I was the one who organized the holidays, because I liked organizing the holidays, and because the organizing was how I expressed a particular kind of love that I did not always have the language for, but that I had always had the capacity for. 19 presents on a workbench on Christmas Eve was the expression of that capacity and that love. The text was the information that the capacity and the love had not been sufficient for something I had not been told was insufficient. Our 3 children, David, who was 38, Cara, who was 35, and James, who was 32, had grown up with Christmas as the anchor holiday of the year, the one that I had invested the most in building into something they would carry into their own families as a standard rather than a memory. Every year from the time David was 3 years old, I had organized Christmas in the same structure. Christmas Eve in our house for whoever was local, which typically included at least 2 of the 3 children, and a variable number of grandchildren and in-laws and friends who had nowhere else to be. Christmas Day at the house with the full family, all 3 children, their partners, the 5 grandchildren, occasionally extended family from Margaret's side or mine. I cooked Christmas dinner. I had been cooking Christmas dinner for 19 years. Prime rib, roasted vegetables, the Yorkshire pudding recipe I had learned from a British colleague in my logistics years, and that my children had declared annually as the best thing I made, and that I had made every Christmas since 2004. The table I had extended to seat 16. The centerpiece that was a standing tradition involving a specific set of candles that had been replenished every year, and an arrangement of greenery from the backyard that I cut myself on Christmas Eve morning. All of it, every element, had been built and maintained and improved over 19 years by me. The text on Christmas Eve was the information that the person who had been the beneficiary of all of it for 19 years no longer wanted me present for it. I stood in the garage and I thought about that for 3 minutes. Then I made my calls. The first call was to the butcher. I had ordered a standing rib roast 14 days earlier, 8 pounds, dry-aged, the specific order I placed every year in early December for pickup on Christmas Eve afternoon, which I had already completed. The roast was in the refrigerator. I called the butcher and told him I had a situation and asked if he knew anyone who could use an 8-pound standing rib roast on Christmas Eve. He said he would ask around. I told him it was in excellent condition and that whoever got it should know it needed to come to room temperature for 2 hours before going in the oven, and that the internal temperature for medium rare was 130 degrees, and to pull it at 125 and let it carry over. The butcher said he had a family in need in his neighborhood and that they would know what to do with it. I said good. The second call was to the florist who had been holding my Christmas centerpiece order, the specific arrangement of seasonal flowers I had ordered 3 weeks earlier for the table. I told them the delivery was canceled. They said it was too late for a refund, but that they would donate the arrangement to a senior center if I could release it. I said please do. The third call was to the wine merchant who had a case of wine on hold for me for Christmas Day. I told him to release it. He said he would credit my account for a future order. The fourth call was to my sister Patricia in Louisville. I told her I was not going to be at my house for Christmas, and that I was coming to Louisville, and that I needed a bed for 3 days, and that I would explain when I got there. Patricia said, "Thomas, I have been waiting for you to call me for 2 years." I did not ask her what she meant. I finished the calls. I looked at the 19 wrapped presents on the workbench. I took the 5 that were for my grandchildren and I put them in the car. The rest I left on the workbench. I went inside. I packed a bag. I drove to Louisville. Patricia was 66 years old and had known me for all 63 years of my existence, and had known Margaret for 22 of them, and had the older sister's particular combination of complete loyalty to her sibling and complete unwillingness to protect that sibling from uncomfortable truths. She made tea when I arrived at 11:30 on Christmas Eve, and we sat in her kitchen, and she told me what she had meant by waiting for me to call for 2 years. She said she had watched, across several family gatherings over the preceding 2 years, a dynamic developing between Margaret and our children, specifically between Margaret and David's wife Karen and Kara's husband Phil. A dynamic in which I had been progressively repositioned from the center of the family's holiday gatherings to a supporting role that was valued for what it produced: the cooking, the organizing, the presents, the logistics of making the gatherings function, and not valued for the person producing it. She said she had tried to raise this with me once, obliquely, at a family gathering the previous Easter, and that I had changed the subject in the specific way I change subjects when I have heard something I am not ready to engage with. I thought about that Easter conversation. She was right. I had not been ready. I was ready now. Patricia talked for an hour. She described specific moments, specific conversations she had overheard, specific ways in which the narrative about our family had been reorganized around Margaret and the children and their spouses in a way that treated my contributions as ambient rather than central. By the time she finished, I had a picture that was more complete than the one I had been carrying, and that explained several things I had observed without fully assembling. I said, "Pat, why didn't you push harder?" She said, "Because you are the most stubborn person I have ever loved, and pushing harder would have pushed you away from the truth rather than toward it." I said, "That is probably accurate." She said, "I know." We finished our tea. She showed me to the guest room. I slept 8 hours, which was more than I had slept at a stretch in months. I woke up at 7 on Christmas morning in Patricia's guest room, and I lay there for a while thinking about the workbench and the presents and the roast in the refrigerator and the centerpiece that was going to a senior center and the case of wine that was going back on a shelf. I thought about 19 years of Christmas mornings in my house. I thought about the prime rib and the Yorkshire pudding and the extended table and the candles. I thought about what Patricia had said about ambient versus central. Then I got up, made coffee in Patricia's kitchen, and called my attorney. His name was Franklin Webb, and he had handled my business legal matters for 20 years and had become my personal attorney after the company sale. He answered on the third ring, which told me he was up and that he had the quality of a man who keeps his phone near him, even on Christmas morning, in case something significant needs addressing. I told him what had happened and I told him what I was thinking. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Thomas, I want you to take 48 hours before you make any permanent decisions. Come see me on the 27th. I said I would be there. He said, "In the meantime, do not respond to Margaret's text. Do not call the house. Let the silence speak for you while you are thinking." I said I understood. Then I called each of my 3 children. I called David first. I told him I had received Margaret's text the previous evening and that I was in Louisville with Patricia and that I would not be at the house for Christmas. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, what happened?" I said, "Your mother asked me to find somewhere else to be and I did." He said, "Dad, I didn't know she was going to do that." I said, "I believe you, David." I called Kara. She was upset in the specific way that middle children are upset when the structure of their family is disturbed, not about the specific event, but about what the specific event represents. She said, "Dad, this isn't right." I said, "No. It is not." I called James. James said, "Dad, I'm coming to Louisville." I told him to stay with his family for Christmas and that we would talk soon. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am thinking clearly." "That is the most okay I can be right now." He said that was enough. I believed him. Franklin Webb was 68 years old and had the quality of a man who had been practicing law long enough to have seen every variation of every family and financial situation, and who had retained the ability to think clearly about all of them, because he had never made the mistake of thinking that legal matters and emotional matters were separate categories. He had handled the sale of my company and the estate planning that followed, and he knew my financial position with the completeness that comes from years of sustained professional engagement. I sat across from him on the 27th of December and told him the full picture, the text, the canceled orders, Louisville, Patricia's account of the preceding 2 years, the conversations with the children. He listened with the focused patience that was his professional signature. When I finished, he said, "Thomas, I need to ask you a direct question." "What do you want?" I said, "I want to understand what happened before I decide what to do about it. And I want to make sure that whatever I decide from a position of clarity and documentation rather than from the middle of a Christmas Eve." He said, "That is exactly the right answer." He said, "Here is what I want to do. I want to review your estate documents and your financial structure with current eyes. I want to make sure everything is in order and accurately reflects your intentions as you understand them today rather than as you understood them at the time of the company sale. And I want to have a conversation with you about the legal framework around the current situation, what your rights are, what the options are, and what the sequence of decisions should look like if you decide to make significant changes." I said, "Start today." He said, "I already started." I pulled the files this morning. Franklin and I spent 3 meetings in January reviewing the full picture of my financial and estate situation. The company sale proceeds had been invested and structured at the time of the sale, with certain assumptions about my family situation that the text on Christmas Eve had prompted me to revisit with fresh eyes. The estate documents had been written with Margaret as the primary beneficiary and with the 3 children as secondary beneficiaries in equal shares. The investment accounts had beneficiary designations that reflected the same structure. The house was jointly owned. Franklin walked me through every element with the thoroughness I had asked for and with the honest assessment of what each element meant in the context of what had happened and what might happen next. I made several decisions across those 3 meetings, and I want to describe them plainly because plainness is the correct register for this part of the story. I did not immediately file for divorce. I was not certain that was the right outcome, and I was not going to make that decision from the middle of January while the situation was still developing. What I did was ensure that my financial position was accurately documented and protected in a manner that meant no informal or unilateral action could alter it without my knowledge and consent. Franklin restructured several elements of the estate to add protections that the original documents had not included. He established a clear accounting of the assets I had brought into the marriage and the assets generated during the marriage and the distinction between them, a distinction that becomes legally relevant in certain circumstances, and that I wanted documented while my memory of the full history was current and complete. I also made a decision about the house that I will describe separately. Margaret called me in mid-January. I had been staying at a short-term rental in Nashville while the situation developed, a 2-bedroom apartment in a building near Franklin's office that I had found through a property contact, and that suited me in the practical sense of providing a quiet and functional space in which to think and work and live without the weight of the house and its 19 years. When she called, I answered because avoiding the call was not consistent with the kind of man I was trying to be in this situation, which was a man who dealt with difficult things directly, even when directly was harder than not. She sounded tired in the way that people sound when they have been managing something alone, and the management has become more exhausting than whatever the thing was. She said she wanted to talk. I said we could meet in February, that I needed a few more weeks before I was ready to have the conversation that needed to be had, and that I wanted to have it in person and not on the phone and not at the house. She said she understood. We met in February at a neutral location, a restaurant in Nashville that neither of us had any specific history with, and we sat across from each other for 3 hours and had the most honest conversation of our 22 years together. Margaret told me things I had not known. She told me that she had been feeling invisible in the marriage for several years, not unloved but unpartnered, that the way I organized and managed and produced had created a dynamic in which she felt like a beneficiary rather than a participant, and that over time the feeling had become a weight she had not known how to address directly. She said the text on Christmas Eve had been a failure of courage and a failure of communication, and that she was ashamed of it and that she was sorry. I told her that I heard what she was saying about the dynamic and that I was willing to examine my contribution to it. I also told her that the text and what Patricia had described about the preceding 2 years had changed something in my understanding of my own situation that I could not change back, and that whatever came next, whether that was a different kind of marriage or the end of one, it was going to be built on a foundation of honesty that we had not been standing on for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. She cried. I did not. We sat with everything for a long time. We did not resolve anything that day. We began. I want to tell you about the house separately because the house decision was its own kind of statement about what I understood the preceding 19 years to have meant. The house in Tennessee was jointly owned and was appraised at approximately $940,000. Franklin had walked me through the options regarding the house in several different scenarios. In the scenario where the marriage continued, the house remained as it was. In the scenario where the marriage ended, the house would be subject to the standard division considerations of Tennessee family law. I made a decision that was independent of those scenarios, and that I made because it reflected what I believed rather than what was strategically optimal. I told Franklin I wanted to ensure that whatever happened with the marriage, the financial contribution I had made to the house, both the purchase and 19 years of maintenance and improvement, was documented accurately and specifically. Not to create a weapon, to create a record that accurately reflected who had built what and to what degree and over what period. Franklin said, that is a reasonable and appropriate thing to document. He documented it. The record exists. It is in the file that contains every other relevant document from this period. I will not need to use it aggressively. I may not need to use it at all. But it is there and it is accurate, and accuracy was what I owed to myself after 19 years of contribution that had been ambient rather than central, and that deserved at minimum to be seen clearly in a document, even if it had not always been seen clearly at a dinner table. I drove the 5 presents for my grandchildren to David's house in Nashville on the 28th of December. David opened the door, and I could tell from the way he looked at me that he had been carrying the weight of what had happened in a way that was affecting him, and that he had not fully put down. I handed him the presents. He said, "Dad, do you want to come in?" I said yes. The grandchildren came running when they heard my voice, and I sat on the floor of David's living room on the 28th of December and watched 5 grandchildren open presents from their grandfather, and the particular chaos and joy of that experience was the best thing that happened to me in the entire period between Christmas Eve and the February meeting. My youngest granddaughter, who was 3, climbed into my lap after she had opened her present and sat there with complete unself-consciousness for about 20 minutes while the older children played around us, and I held her and thought about the workbench and the scissors and the 647 text and all the 19 years of Christmas Eves that had preceded it, and I decided that the child in my lap and the chaos of the room and the being present for it, was what all of it had been for, and was what all of it was going to continue to be for regardless of whatever else was also true. It is 11 months since Christmas Eve. Margaret and I are in couples therapy, a process I had resisted for years with the specific resistance of a man who believed that the right way to address problems was to address them directly rather than through a facilitated process, and that I have reconsidered completely based on the evidence of what direct addressing alone had produced over the preceding years, which was a Christmas Eve text. The therapy is uncomfortable and productive in the way that useful things are often both simultaneously. we are not certain where we are going. We are more honest with each other than we have been in years and possibly in the history of the marriage. And I find that honesty, while not comfortable, is more solid than the version of the marriage that had been built on the management of impressions and the production of holidays and the ambient versus central dynamic that Patricia had named, and that the therapy has explored in more depth than either of us fully anticipated. The house is still our house. The financial documentation Franklin prepared exists in its file, and I hope it remains there unused. The Christmas traditions are in suspension this year, not canceled, suspended, pending a clearer understanding of what they are for and who they are for and how they can be built on a foundation that is more honest than the one they were built on before. I am not certain of the outcome. I am certain that I am not going to build another 19 years on a foundation I cannot see clearly. That much is settled. I want to be direct about what the text on Christmas Eve actually cost and what it did not cost. It did not cost me my relationship with my children, who have been present and honest with me in the months, since in ways that have been both painful and clarifying. It did not cost me my relationship with my grandchildren, who are too young to understand what is happening between the adults in their family, and who know only that their grandfather shows up with presents and sits on the floor and holds them in his lap. It did not cost me my financial security or my sense of who I am or the accumulated competence of a life built on showing up. What it cost was the version of Christmas that I had been building for 19 years, the prime rib and the Yorkshire pudding, and the extended table and the candles, and the specific combination of effort and love that those things represented. I am not sure yet whether that version of Christmas is something that can be rebuilt on a more honest foundation, or whether it was, in some fundamental way, a performance of a family that was not quite the family it was performing being. I am sitting with that question. Some questions do not resolve quickly. Some questions require a full year of sitting before they become answerable. I am giving this one the year it needs. My name is Thomas Brewer. I am 63 years old. I grew up in Louisville in a house where family was operational rather than decorative, and where showing up was the primary expression of love and the primary expectation of those who were loved. I built a company for 20 years and sold it at 60, and built a marriage for 22 years and wrapped 19 presents on a Christmas Eve, and received a text at 6:47 that told me to find somewhere else to be. I canceled the butcher and the florist and the wine merchant, and I drove to Louisville with 5 presents for my grandchildren, and I sat in my sister's kitchen, and I heard the truth I had been changing the subject away from for 2 years. I called my attorney on Christmas morning. I showed up for the conversation in February. I sat on my son's floor on the 28th of December and held my youngest granddaughter in my lap while the room was full of chaos and joy, and I understood that this was what it had all been for, and that this was what it was all going to continue to be for. They sent a text and told me to leave. I canceled absolutely everything, and I left with clarity and documentation and the particular dignity of a man who refuses to pretend that the foundation is solid when it needs to be rebuilt. The rebuilding is underway. I am doing my part. That is all I have ever done and all I know how to do. It has always been enough. If this story reached something and you leave a comment below, tell me where you are watching from. There are more of us out here than anyone admits. Subscribe if you have not already. There is always more to come.